All right, everybody, we are back for our next section in our cybercrime course, and this is section 11, all about cyberbullying, cyberstalking, and cyber harassment. Now, these three crimes are classified as cyber violence for a very specific reason. People who have been seriously bullied, stalked, and or harassed online will tell you that it absolutely has negative emotional and physical repercussions. It can cause a lot of damage and a lot of changes to victims' lifestyles, up to and including death. Okay? Now, bullying, harassment, and stalking are three very overlapping problems. It's very often difficult or impossible to determine whether any given situation or any given action or any given kind of victim offender interaction qualifies as one or two or even all three of those things. There's a lot of overlap in these three crimes and in their definitions, right? So trying to single out and determine whether any given crime or any given instance was bullying or stalking or harassment is usually kind of a fool's errand. It's usually difficult or impossible to do, and thus it's kind of a lot of these have been lumped together in a lot of ways, both legally and from a research perspective. Now, kind of the most famous incident of cyberbullying, cyberstalking is a young girl named Megan Meyer. And Megan Meyer was a teen who was informed by someone online that they were, befriended online by someone and came to believe this person was their friend, but it turns out that person didn't really exist, and that person, pretending to be her friend online, eventually kind of bullied her and harassed her to the point where she ended up committing suicide. So that is kind of the worst case scenario. The when this crime goes far enough, that can be the outcome. And Megan Meyer and there have been many other famous instances of what's called catfishing. Catfishing is the fancy term for an offender creating a fake profile and then engaging in a relationship with the victim. And it always starts out like any relationship, sweet and happy and wonderful. But then the offender will usually either turn it into a bullying and harassment situation or an economic fraud scam situation or some other kind of taking advantage of the victim there because they're not actually who they claim to be. A few years ago, there was a famous NFL player that it turns out their significant other online turned out to be a catfishing situation, and it was all over the news. So this is not just a thing that happens to teenagers. This is not just a thing that happens to normal people. This can happen to anybody. Now, bullying has a lot of kind of levels. Bullying has a lot of different behaviors associated with it. There's flaming, which is essentially the fancy word for arguing, calling each other names, getting in kind of a war of the words online, if you will. There's denigration, which is where the offender will post some kind of information about the victim, whether true or not, in order to hurt their character, their reputation, make people believe things about them that are negative, again, whether true or not true. Impersonation, that's when the offender makes some kind of online profile, social media, posts on a school forum, whatever, pretending to be the victim and saying like embarrassing or controversial or negative things. Outing and doxing. Outing is something, posting true information about a person, but in an effort to embarrass them. So this is especially common with, LGBT victims. A bad offender will kind of out them on, social media, post about their sexuality, where friends, family, schoolmates, coworkers, etc., can see it. And then doxing is posting usually things like phone numbers, addresses, email addresses, things like that. So the victim will have their phone number posted on a message board, and then that victim will receive lots of harassing phone calls, or they'll have their address posted somewhere and then receive lots of, nasty letters, or, worst case scenario, people showing up at their house. Trickery just means kind of, lying to them, making the victim believe something that's not true, that has a negative impact on the victim's life. Exclusion, of course, refers to keeping the victim out of spaces where they either have a right to be or should be, maybe the forum for a high school class or something. And then, of course, harassment and stalking. Bullying, harassment, and stalking have a lot of overlap, and you rarely find one without at least one of the other two, right? Now, bullying causes lots of harm. Again, it's classified as a violent cybercrime for a reason. There's emotional harm, i.e., people become sad, depressed, anxious. There's psychological harm, where people can internalize negative feelings, develop numerous different psychological issues. And then, of course, there's physical harm. And physical harm can come not, in a few different ways. But the emotional and psychological harm causes physical change in the body, right? If you develop depression, if you are constantly feeling negative emotions, that can have physical changes in your body. Panic attacks are not just all in your head, as many claim. They do cause a physical damage to the human body. And then, of course, there's physical harm from things like self-harm, suicide attempts, and of course, worst case scenario, completed and successful, in quotes, suicide attempts. Now, who's more likely to be a victim and an offender for bullying? Victims, there's some research that says women or young females, girls, I guess is the correct term there, are more likely to be victims. But then there's also research that suggests that men and women, or again, I should say boys and girls, are kind of equally likely to be victims. So that's kind of up in the air. It depends on what research you look at. For offenders, essentially, most of the research there says that there's no real gender difference. For age, younger children are more likely to be the victims of in-person bullying, but as children get older and reach that kind of late teens kind of area, that's when they're more likely to be victims of cyberbullying. And that, I believe, probably correlates with social media use because, younger children tend not to have as much social media use, and older children do. And the more you use social media, the more likely you are to be a victim of bullying, which I believe is, should be fairly obvious. The more information people put out about themselves, the more likely they are to be a victim of bullying. So the more potential victims post about who they are and what they think and how they feel and all those things, which is something we should be encouraging. The downside is it also, the more information you put out, the more likely you are to be the victim of bullying. And then, of course, if you are a victim of bullying in real life, you are more likely to be a victim of bullying online as well. Now, how much cyberbullying is happening? This is a lot. This is a very difficult question to answer. First off, bullying is a worldwide problem. This is not just something that's limited to the United States, not just limited to the Western world, not just limited to industrialized nations. This is something that happens all over the world, rich countries, poor countries, young and old. But rates differ, right? Depending on where you're looking, when you're looking, and most importantly, how you define all your terms, right? So when I teach my research methods class, I always start off the first day by talking about having an entire argument with the class about what is a sandwich, right? Define a sandwich. And then no matter what students try to say to define a sandwich, I find an example of something we all think of as a sandwich that doesn't meet that definition. And then once they get broader definitions, I find something that we all clearly don't think is a sandwich that meets that definition. So definitions and how we define terms is a very important part of research and answering questions like this. And cyberbullying is defined in a lot of different ways. And even a very small change in definition and a small change in how we start measuring that concept can result in hugely different estimated rates for how much cyberbullying is actually happening, right? But looking at decent and better research, there's been estimates everywhere from 5% of people out there have been cyberbullied at some point to 50% of the people out there have been cyberbullied. So my personal opinion, using my personal definitions, I'm more inclined to believe the higher numbers. But again, it all kind of depends on how you define terms, where you look, when you look. And of course, over time, this is going to change massively because the rate of people spending time online, the number of people that have access to online spaces is growing all the time and continues to grow. So a study done in 2005 is going to have vastly different answers than a study done in 2012, which is going to have vastly different answers than a study performed in 2023. So we know it's happening. We know it's a problem. And we're almost certain that it's a growing problem. Anyway, we will be back for the second half of this section in just a moment. Thank you for watching.